If your reflection could speak, would it accuse you or ask to be remembered? You look in the mirror. The face looking back mimics your movements, blinks when you blink, smiles when you force it to. But something's off. It feels like watching a stranger impersonate you with disturbing accuracy. Not wrong enough to scream, just wrong enough to wonder, when did I lose touch with the one behind the glass? Most people move through life surrounded by eyes, parents, peers, screens, systems. But being seen is not the same as being recognized. In fact, the more we are seen, the more we learn to perform. And the more we perform, the more a quiet erosion begins. Not of appearance, not of behavior, but of something far more intimate, the inner self. This is the first wound of shame. It doesn't arrive as pain. It arrives as a disconnection. You're told to be good. But good means obedient. You're told to be polite. But polite means agreeable. You're told to be successful. But success means acceptance. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a new identity forms, crafted not from desire, but from defense. A patchwork personality, stitched from what others find pleasing and what you've been taught is safe. And in this process, the real self, the wild one, the strange one, the one with inconvenient thoughts and unpredictable feelings, gets quietly pushed into the shadows. Carl Jung called this disowned self the shadow, not because it's evil, but because it's hidden. It's the part of us that contains not just our forbidden instincts, but our forgotten depth, our sadness, our creativity, our rebellion, our truth. And once buried, it begins to rot. But shame tells us not to notice. It trains us to smile in public even when we're dying inside. To nod at the joke that insults us. To post the highlight reel when we're actually falling apart. Shame teaches us not to lie to others, but to lie to ourselves. And when this lie lasts long enough, a split forms. The person we show to the world and the person we are become two separate entities. One performs. The other watches silently, trapped behind the eyes, waiting to be remembered. This split is what philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre called the gaze, the haunting feeling of being turned into an object by someone else's perception. Under this gaze, we start to see ourselves the way we think others see us. We internalize the judgments, the criticisms, the impossible standards. And slowly, we stop being someone with a self and become something with a function. You see it. In cultures where shame is a virtue, where women are taught modesty as morality, where boys are told silence is strength, where failure is not a lesson but a disgrace. You see it in the office worker who laughs too quickly, the child who apologizes for crying, the addict who hides not just their habit, but their humanity. They are all reflections, not of who they are, but of who they were forced to become. And still, beneath the masks, beneath the practiced scripts and contorted smiles, something waits. A memory. A name. A presence that refuses to fully die. It looks out through tired eyes, not with judgment, but with quiet hope. Hoping that one day, you'll notice the silence. You'll hear the voice beneath the noise. And you'll remember what shame was meant to make you forget. But this forgetting, this disappearance of self, didn't happen in isolation. It didn't begin with you. This rupture was passed down, like a sacred silence whispered across generations. And to understand where the mirror first cracked, we must ask not just who we are, but whose ghosts we carry. What if your shame didn't begin with you? Before you learned to speak, before you could even name what you felt, something was already shaping your silence. The discomfort you feel when praised, the hesitation in your voice when asking for help, the guilt that blooms in moments of rest. It may not be yours alone. It may be ancestral, inherited, breathed in before you knew you were breathing. We often think of shame as something we earn, a mistake, a failure, a punishment for breaking the rules. But what if the rules themselves were written long before we arrived? What if the shame we carry was planted by the people who raised us, because they were raised by people who couldn't speak of what broke them? In psychology, Freud called it the formation of the superego, the moral voice implanted by our parents, charged with enforcing the values of the tribe. But that moral voice is rarely kind. It's a prosecutor with no interest in truth, only conformity. It punishes not just wrongdoing, but difference. Not just harm, but visibility. Nietzsche described this inherited morality as slave morality, a system born from powerlessness, where virtues like obedience and humility were elevated by the oppressed because they had no access to strength. Over time, these values weren't just tolerated, they were sanctified. And with sanctity came shame, not for wrongdoing, but for daring to defy what had been handed down. Consider the weight of religious guilt. In Christianity, it begins with original sin, a debt owed at birth. You're taught not that you made a mistake, but that you are the mistake. The same script echoes across cultures. The girl shamed for her body, the boy taught to swallow his tears, the exile made to believe. His displacement is a divine punishment. It is an old, tired shame, but its grip remains fresh. Jung believed in the collective unconscious, that below the level of personal memory lies a deeper layer of inherited symbols, traumas, and instincts. These are not things we remember. They are things we embody. And when an entire lineage has been taught to hide its wounds, the silence becomes louder than the truth. Think of the child born to a family of war survivors. The parents never speak of the terror. They wear smiles. They say everything is fine. But the child senses something, a tension in the air, a haunted rhythm in the laughter. They internalize it without question. There must be something wrong with me. Not knowing that they are simply inhaling an unspoken history. Or imagine the immigrant whose parents fled persecution. Their accent becomes a source of mockery, their culture a target. So they adapt. They edit themselves. They shrink. But the shame they feel isn't about culture. It's about survival. A quiet agreement is made. We must be less so we are not punished. Even mythology speaks of this inheritance. In the Greek legend, Cassandra was cursed to speak the truth and never be believed. Her shame wasn't about lying. It was about being ignored, dismissed, erased. Her pain wasn't hers alone. It was generational, prophetic, and tragic. We walk through our lives in homes filled with portraits, faces of those who came before us. Some we revere, others we ignore. But each one whispers something, a belief, a fear, a command. Sometimes it's subtle. Stay quiet. Other times, it's devastating. You are unworthy, and yet we obey. Even when we don't remember why. Even when the cost is forgetting who we are. But what makes shame so effective, so contagious, isn't just where it came from. It's how it's used, not merely as punishment, but as a strategy, a tool, a mechanism of control. One that doesn't need force, because it makes us volunteer our obedience. What if shame wasn't weakness, but design? We tend to think of shame as something personal, a bruise on the ego, a private wound. But what if shame is less about emotion and more about engineering? Less a byproduct of society and more a tool it depends on? There's a reason shame feels so paralyzing. It doesn't just hurt, it shapes. It doesn't just punish, it programs. Michel Foucault described this through the metaphor of the panopticon, a circular prison designed so that each prisoner could be seen at any time, but never know when they were being watched. The genius wasn't in the surveillance itself. It was in the uncertainty. Eventually, the prisoner would internalize the watcher, disciplining themselves without needing to be told. That's the architecture of shame. You don't need guards when people police their own minds. In schools, it starts early, not with chains, but with rules. Sit still. Don't speak unless called. Keep your eyes forward. Praise is handed out for obedience. Shame is delivered for disruption. Slowly, children learn that being quiet is safer than being curious, and so they fold themselves into something manageable. Something is correct. On social media, shame has become automated. Algorithms reward conformity and punish deviation. One wrong post, one misunderstood word, and the mob arrives. Apologies become performance. Outrage becomes currency. Even when the anger is justified, the mechanism remains the same. Fear of being seen, misseen, or worse, exiled. Cancel culture didn't invent this. It simply digitized it. In governments, especially authoritarian ones, shame is nationalized. Dissent is reframed as disloyalty. Moral panic is manufactured to keep the population afraid of being on the wrong side. Books are banned. Histories are rewritten. Citizens are encouraged to confess not just their crimes, but their thoughts. Over time, guilt is not attached to action, but to identity. It's not what you did, it's who you are. Even religion, in many traditions, operates through rituals of obedience tied to shame. Confession, repentance, public displays of purity. You are forgiven, but only after being humbled. The lesson is clear. To be accepted, you must first declare yourself broken. What all these systems share is subtlety. No whips, no walls, just mirrors. And the terrifying feeling that someone, somewhere, is watching. Or worse, might be. And so we build prisons we can't see. We wear masks, we forget our masks. We edit our thoughts before we even have them. We become the enforcers of our own suppression. The paradox is cruel. Shame presents itself as conscience, but functions as control. It dresses like morality, but acts like surveillance. And the more invisible it is, the more effective it becomes. Imagine a figure building a cell from mirrors. Each mirror reflects a version of themselves others want to see. They polish it, they arrange it, they admire it. Then finally, they step inside and lock the door. Not because someone forced them to, but because it's the only place they feel safe. When shame becomes systemized, the question isn't whether we're watched. It's whether we even remember who's watching anymore. If you act long enough, do you become an act? Shame doesn't always silence you. Sometimes it hands you a script, a role. A version of yourself that seems safer, more acceptable, less likely to be judged, rejected, or destroyed, and so you play it. At first with hesitation, then with polish, until the role becomes second nature, and the original self fades, like a name you no longer respond to. Carl Jung called it the persona, the mask we show the world. A necessary fiction, a social costume. But the danger begins when we mistake the mask for the person. When the role we crafted for survival becomes our prison. Sociologist Irving Goffman deepened this metaphor. He suggested that life is a performance, that we are all actors on various stages, constantly adjusting our roles depending on the audience. But in shame-based cultures, this isn't just adaptation, it's camouflage. The stakes aren't social convenience, they're existential. You aren't merely playing a part, you're hiding from exile. The boy who learns to suppress his sensitivity. The girl who teaches herself to smile when she wants to scream. The immigrant who changes their accent to sound less foreign. The queer artist who codes their truth into metaphors. The influencer who curates a flawless persona because algorithms punish realness. These are not lies, they are strategies. But they come at a cost. And the cost is not just exhaustion, it's amnesia. Over time, the mask doesn't just conceal, it consumes. You start forgetting when you were pretending and when you were honest. You rehearse your lines so often that improvisation feels dangerous. You smile on command, laugh on cue. You are loved for the character, but not the person, because even you don't remember who that is anymore. History offers countless examples of this identity erosion. Think of writers and artists under totalitarian regimes, forced to flatter power, code their dissent, or abandon their work entirely. To survive, they had to split. The public face aligned with the regime. The private self whispered into journals or vanished into silence. In the modern world, the repression is subtler, but just as suffocating. Social media trains us to present not who we are, but who gains approval. Flaws are filtered. Emotions are monetized. We smile not because we're happy, but because the algorithm smiles back. And slowly, we start to confuse performance with reality, followers with friends, validation with value. And beneath the mask, something tragic happens. We lose the ability to recognize ourselves, not metaphorically, literally. Psychological studies show that long-term self-monitoring can distort one's sense of identity. If you edit your truth long enough, it starts to sound like someone else's voice. Imagine standing in front of a mirror, removing your mask, only to discover your reflection is blank. No eyes, no expression. Just a hollow outline, waiting to be filled with whatever others expect next. It's not that we become false. It's that we become fragmented, layers of performance piled over a silenced core. And eventually, we forget that there was ever something real beneath it all. And when your face disappears, who then speaks inside your mind? What if the voice in your head was trained to hate you? It whispers like a warning, cloaked as conscience. It corrects, critiques, condemns, but it doesn't sound foreign. It sounds like you. That's the genius of internalized shame. It doesn't need to scream over your thoughts. It becomes them. Psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud called this voice the superego, the internalized parent, judge, and jury of the psyche. Born from early authority figures, it exists to regulate behavior. But when shame seeps into its structure, the superego becomes less a guide and more an executioner. It doesn't encourage, it punishes. Not just for what you've done, but for who you are. Spiritual traditions have long understood the power of this internal critic. Catholic guilt, for instance, isn't merely about sin, it's about contamination. An inherited sense of moral failure that lingers even after confession. You don't just feel you did something wrong, you are wrong. The shame is embedded in your sense of self, like a virus in your operating system. In modern psychology, this manifests as perfectionism, imposter syndrome, and chronic self-sabotage. You rehearse apologies before you've spoken. You delete honest thoughts before they're posted. You smile when you want to cry, not because anyone asked you to, but because the invisible audience in your mind demands it. This is what philosopher Michel Foucault called self-surveillance. In totalitarian regimes, people were forced to watch what they said. But in liberal societies, people learn to watch themselves. The state no longer needs to silence you if you've been trained to silence yourself. And so the voice evolves, not as censorship, but as shame wrapped in reason. Consider how many lives are curated around this voice. Careers built on maintaining a persona. Friendships shaped by fear of abandonment. Even private moments are distorted by imagined judgments. You find yourself rehearsing your emotions, not just expressing them, trying to feel the right thing, not just say it. The performance seeps inward. Think of the influencer who deletes a post after rereading it 30 times, still unsure if it's too much. Think of the man who hides his tears, not from the world, but from his own reflection. Think of the child who stifles their curiosity to avoid ridicule. The voice inside them is no longer theirs. It belongs to 1,000 past critics, stitched into a single authority, whispering from behind their thoughts. And yet it rarely screams. That's what makes it so effective. It corrects gently, with just enough guilt to keep you from questioning it. Like an echo in a cathedral, it sounds holy, like the truth. But it is not. It is constructed, and it can be deconstructed. This voice does not appear overnight. It is trained, sharpened, and rehearsed, until it becomes automatic. And by then, the original self, the unfiltered, untamed voice beneath, has gone silent. But some voices don't just survive the shame, they rise because of it. What if shame was the beginning, not the end? Most people run from shame. They hide it, bury it, rebrand it. But there have always been a few, very few, who do the unthinkable. They face it, they wear it. And in doing so, they turn it into something else entirely. Start with Diogenes, a man who lived in a barrel, mocked emperors, and defecated in public as a form of protest. To the polished citizens of ancient Athens, he was the embodiment of disgrace. But Diogenes didn't see shame as something to escape. He saw it as a lie, the false mask society forces upon those who threaten its illusion. So he exposed it, in every sense of the word. His philosophy wasn't in books, it was in his body, his behavior, his raw defiance. By embracing what others condemned, he revealed how fragile the rules really were. Fast forward to Frida Kahlo, a woman shattered, literally, by a bus accident, by chronic pain, by betrayal, by infertility. Every wound she suffered, she painted, not as decoration, as a declaration. Her art bled with symbolism. Thorns through flesh, corsets made of metal, eyes staring out of ruptured bodies. In a world that told her to smile through the pain and hide her scars, she framed them. She didn't just survive shame, she made it unforgettable, or go back further to Hypatia, a philosopher and scientist in ancient Alexandria, female, pagan, brilliant. Everything society told her she should not be, and she paid for it. Torn apart by a mob for defying patriarchal control. But her legacy survived, not as a martyr, but as a challenge. A reminder that when shame is weaponized, it can also be wielded. Her very existence was an act of rebellion. These were not perfect people. They were wounded, mocked, misunderstood. But they refused to let shame dictate the terms of their lives. Instead, they dragged it into the light. And in that confrontation, something alchemical happened. Shame became strength, not by hiding it, but by owning it. This is the existential idea of authenticity. Not living without shame, but living despite it. Reclaiming the voice beneath the masks, the story beneath the scripts. It's the moment you stop asking for permission to exist. It's not glamorous. It doesn't feel good. Often, it starts with isolation, with ridicule. But it's also the only path to freedom that doesn't end in self-betrayal. Shame is powerful because it tells you that your pain disqualifies you from belonging, that your scars make you unworthy. But what if the opposite is true? What if the scars are the proof that you fought, that you refused to disappear? The rebels didn't transcend shame by pretending it didn't hurt. They turned toward it, let it burn through them, and emerged with something deeper, a self not built for applause, but for truth. Because rebellion isn't the destination. It's the path to something deeper. Something is still coming into view. Something not built on defiance alone, but on a redefinition of value itself. The kind of value that cannot be revoked, because it was never borrowed. And that raises the question, if your scars could speak, would they apologize? Or testify? What if who you were never left? Rebellion shatters the illusion. But what comes after the breaking is not destruction. It's an excavation. Shame buries. It covers, silences, represses. Over time, the self beneath it grows faint like a distant echo in a locked room. But what shame conceals, it cannot erase. Beneath the roles, beneath the masks, beneath the learned obedience, something waits. Carl Jung called it individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are by reuniting with the parts you were taught to exile, not by adding more, but by peeling away the lies. It's not self-creation, it's self-recollection, in Nei. Zen, There's the idea of emptiness, not as void, but as openness. The moment the false self crumbles, silence rushes in. And in that silence, you hear something forgotten. Not a command, not a judgment, just a memory of who you were before you were edited. Myth captures this moment in the story of Persephone. Stolen into the underworld, she becomes queen of shadows. But every year she rises, emerging with flowers in her hands. Her return is not a rejection of darkness, but a passage through it. She brings back what the surface world forgot, that life and death, light and shame, are not enemies, they're mirrors. You do not escape shame by denying it. You transcend it by reclaiming what it tried to bury. This is the sacred violence of remembering. It is not easy. It's a kind of mourning, grieving the years lost pretending. But then, something begins to stir. The child before the fear, the voice before it was trained to whisper, the body before it was corrected into posture. It doesn't return as fantasy. It returns as fact. It always was. You just forgot. This is not a story of invention. It's a resurrection. And what rises is not the self that wins approval. It's the self that never needed it. There's awe in this moment, because to remember who you are is to realize you were never truly broken, only buried. And now that you've remembered who you are, you must decide what to do with it. What if shame was not a curse, but a compass? For most of your life, you may have treated shame like a disease. Something to hide, to suppress, to reject. But what if that was never its purpose? What if shame, in its twisted form, was never trying to break you, but show you the path to who you were meant to become? The final lie of shame is that it must be destroyed. But destruction is still violence, still resistant. And anything you resist persists. True. Freedom doesn't come from avoiding shame. It comes from walking into it and not turning away. Because shame is not the enemy, it's the map. The places it hurts most are the places you were told you were too much, or not enough, or wrong. But these are also the places that hold the raw material of your identity. Shame is the spotlight that reveals what was exiled, and in that exile lives the unclaimed self. In Jungian psychology, this is known as shadow integration, the process of not just noticing the darkness, but inviting it in, sitting with it, listening to it, not to become the shadow, but to become whole. We do not transcend by amputating parts of ourselves. We transcend by remembering we are not pieces. We are all of it. The fear, the silence, the rebellion, the ache, and the voice that rose through all of it. Inner child work speaks to the same truth, that the parts of you trapped in shame are not broken. They are frozen, waiting for you, the adult self, the integrated self, to come back, not with more rules, but with recognition, with compassion. With the words that were never said, you were never the problem. The spiritual traditions of the world often speak of suffering not as punishment, but as initiation. A sacred fire that burns away illusion until only the essential remains. Shame, when confronted, becomes that fire. It strips you bare, and what's left is not shameful. What's left is real. This is not a cinematic explosion of freedom. It's quieter, more seismic, like the settling of a mountain, like a breath you didn't know you were holding, finally released. You see yourself now, not as the roles you played, not as the mistakes you made, but as the one who endured them, as the one who kept going, as the one who, despite it all, still looks in the mirror and recognizes something behind the eyes. No shame, but survival. not guilt, but grace. This is the great reversal. Shame tried to erase you, but now, you... Remember, you were never ashamed. You were what survived it.